Welcome everyone to this webinar, where the main topic today of the webinar's discussion will be around how you as a company can become data-driven as a business while still maintaining a high level of compliance, in specifically the compliance that is affecting from the GDPR here in Europe. So just a little bit of information on myself. My name is Tim Ward. I am the CEO of CluedIn, and I predominantly have an engineering background in the data space. Specifically over the last 5 years, I've been focusing in mainly data integration, data governance, and all of the components that are necessary to build a good big data story for businesses. So what we do at CluedIn is that we help companies become data-driven by building a business data fabric. The translation of this is that we help a company to integrate and connect the data that is typically dispersed and scattered across their business into one single place where we can automate a lot of the organization of the data for you. So this is all of the cleaning and the data preparation that is typically quite tedious and not so efficient in the ways that we are working with data today. From a management perspective, we give management governance tools to be able to easily see the accuracy and the quality and the completeness of the data that sits across this fabric. But most importantly, what we think is necessary for businesses to become much more data-driven is the fact that CluedIn gives easy access to the data that sits across this data fabric. At CluedIn, we focus on building your company data fabric so that you can start to focus on the use cases. So obviously one of the use cases that I will be focusing on today will be that of compliance and GDPR. One of the key takeaways that I'm hoping everyone will get from this webinar is that the same work that's involved in preparing the data fabric for GDPR compliance is actually the same work that's necessary to fuel and enable the rest of the use cases that you can see here on the screen. And I'll be showing you, how you can build your data fabric with CluedIn and how it can enable machine learning and business intelligence to make sure that we can be data-driven in these ways while still maintaining this high level of consent and compliance. Now, without a lot of companies actually knowing it, we were just handed the single best excuse to become data-driven as businesses, and that excuse came in the form of GDPR. What we'll be discussing today is what we at CluedIn refer to as the 6 pillars. And it starts with getting a good idea of what is the landscape of data that companies are working with right now. What are the components that they need as a business to be much more data driven? And then we'll kind of dive into the reality of things. How was it like spending the last 24 to 18 months working with our customers in making them GDPR compliant while maintaining this high level of data-driven functionality? Of course, because of this, we'll be talking about the customer. What was the customer saying about why they invested and took that leap in purchasing the technical underpinning that's necessary to help with the compliance part of GDPR? We wouldn't be a CluedIn webinar without talking about the technology you need to start to build a data fabric for your own business. We will highlight the values. What was the values that the customers actually gained by investing in not only data-driven strategies and data-driven technology, but while maintaining this high level of compliance that us as companies are really responsible for today. And it would be, we would be remiss without highlighting some of the challenges that were in these engagements, not only from a technical perspective, but also from a, an organizational and process perspective as well. For the last 5 years, the CluedIn team has been helping companies become much more data-driven. And from this 5 years of experience and working across industries, we've established what we call the data landscape. So these are all the components that a company needs to be able to be very successful with becoming not only data driven, but compliant at the same time. And of course, the parts that CluedIn focuses on from a value perspective and functionality perspective are highlighted in green. But of course, one of the most key takeaways from this slide should be that, we see this data fabric as the clear abstraction from business to data. From the companies that we were talking with, when we talked to the business, they weren't really worried about, they didn't want to know what cloud provider are we in? What backup and retention strategies do we have in place? Will this query that we write scale across, all of our data? That's not what the business is actually wanting. What the business wants is, can I get access to the data that sits across our tools? When I actually access it to apply to use cases, I want to have some type of confidence that that data is ready to use. So it's clean, it's prepared, it's accurate, it's of high quality. The data that we're working with is relatively complete and ready for our teams to apply. So what we do at CluedIn is we apply this data fabric type of model, and we stitch the pieces and components that are necessary together to be able to fuel this need from the business. Like I said, we have spent the last 24 to 18 months in helping companies become GDPR compliant, and of course there's a lot that we have learnt along the way. There's a lot of experiences that we would like to highlight in this webinar. One of the key patterns that we saw with most of the companies that we engaged with was when we actually analyzed where is the most time spent in becoming compliant, but also becoming data driven. And there were two main areas of work, and that was broken up into organizational effort. This was the typical kind of processes that you can see in the enterprise that need to be done to even start these projects. And those were, establishing process, talking about security and IT and infrastructure, getting compliance and researching products that are necessary to help them become data driven. And the largest chunk of work was actually in the data preparation. Now, if you work in the data space, you don't go far on the internet without reading media about how data scientists, data engineers, they spend anywhere from 60 to 80% of their time in just cleaning and preparing data. And the irony of this situation, of course, being that only about 10% of the time is actually used in applying this data to the business use cases. So some of the companies that have made the leap, that have made the transition with becoming much more data driven as a business with CluedIn, you can see here. And so for some of these companies, they were using different use cases, applying it to GDPR use case, maybe applying it to the business intelligence use case. But all of these companies share one core pattern, and that is that they knew that the future of their business came from easy access to good data that exists across their enterprise. And so if you have a look at these companies today, you can have a look at where the effort actually shifted once they had invested in a data fabric. And the data fabric cannot remove certain parts of the work, so we can still see that there's organizational effort that's involved. We can still see that there is data preparation that's involved, but this is minimized, and with the data fabric, we can really accelerate ourselves to applying our data to many different business use cases. So this is where we saw the actual work shifted in these companies. And the same recurring theme that we heard back from these companies was that with the data fabric in place, they realized that actually the work to become GDPR compliant was similar, if not the same work needed to become data driven. So let's dive into that. It's worth mentioning before we go too far that you don't just solve these problems with technology. And this was the breakdown of what we saw with our engagements, is that different companies would put more onus and effort into the technology piece and less on the process. And some companies were more interested in, when they're becoming data driven, when they are becoming GDPR compliant, to put more onus and stress onto the process side of things. But both of these kind of avenues of solving this problem still had one thing that was core. There was this technical underpinning of good accessibility to quality, accurate data that was scattered typically across the business. So the ability for CluedIn to easily integrate this data and to automate a large percentage of the cleaning, the preparation, the deduplication of data so that we can fuel these use cases was a big win for them. So for putting a data fabric into place, we really see as some of the core foundations of getting a data fabric in place comes from data needs to be connected and integrated. There needs to be some type of data preparation and cleaning techniques. The business needs to have good governance over the data, so they are well aware of the type of service level agreement that they are handing to the business. They need to know that if they are applying this to machine learning, if they are applying this fabric to business intelligence, they need to know these core metrics around what is the quality of the data, the accuracy, what am I feeding this business with? From a technical aspect, the core principles that you need as a company to build a data fabric starts obviously with the integration of data. This is a typical area that we see, a lot of people underestimate the actual work involved in integration. And what we see as a pattern is that it doesn't take businesses too long to actually build an integration, a simple integration to most of the platforms out there that they use. But to really be able to scale it to enterprise sizes, to be able to work with all the different types of authentication mechanisms that are seen in the enterprise, and just the ability to maintain these integrations is a huge piece of work that can be abstracted away from that business given a data fabric. The next step is some type of mechanisms to be able to prepare the data. And this is typically solved in this type of ETL data warehouse type of approach. And one of the core differences that CluedIn makes in this particular case is how much of this process can be actually automated. And a lot of this is due to the not only the technology that sits behind CluedIn, but its ability to take new modern approaches to not relying on the same techniques that we have been using as businesses for the last 15 to 20 years. And finally, it is so important that the business has accessibility to this data. And so when you're looking into a data fabric, one of the core concepts that needs to be established is, can we provide consistent and universal querying capabilities for different business departments to be able to access this data? So one of the ways at CluedIn that we make this easy to get started with your data fabric is with the sheer amount of integrations that we have pre-built. So to date, we have 186 different integrations to SaaS platforms like Dynamics and Salesforce and Office 365, to on-premise software like SharePoint, Lotus Notes, maybe Oracle or SQL databases, and then finally external data sources as well. This could be Alone in Denmark, the CVR registry, 118. In America, it could be SEC. And of course, there are services to be able to enrich data, such as Data.com, Hoovers, and Duns & Bradstreet. So CluedIn has pre-built these integrations so they are plug and play and ready to sync your data into the data fabric. So if we have a look at the bird's eye view of what makes up this data fabric, there are some core principles of what you need as a business to make a good data-driven story while maintaining this level of compliance. And it starts, as I alluded to before, with simple integration. This is where we saw most businesses would not even start these types of projects because of the sheer amount of work and skills that are necessary to integrate and maintain data sources. The next is some type of mechanism to be able to clean, enrich, and validate that the data that's coming into these sources is in some format that is usable, that is ready to be used in the business. Now, obviously, we can't automate everything. Not all of these cleaning and deduplications can actually be automated, even with this new approach. And so what's important is that business users get certain tools to help increase the overall quality of the data fabric, and then data engineers get a very different type of tool to be able to manually elevate these scores and service level agreements of the fabric. Accessibility to the data is important. So unified query languages to be able to extract out the data necessary for the business use case, and to be able to project out exactly the format and the model of data that's needed for that use case. All of this would be remiss without some type of privacy that's built into the data fabric. And so at CluedIn, we have built-in consent management, retention periods, and data policies for you to be able to make sure that when the business is using the data, that it has already gone through the checks and balances of, do I have consent to use this data? Is this data needed to be archived because of retention periods? This is something that the business should not be thinking about. When they access data through the fabric, they know that it's ready to be used for their particular use case. Connected data is so important, and one of the technologies that CluedIn uses is a graph database. And what this helps is to, connect and build context between the relationships between data that sits in your business. One of the side effects of a data fabric is, of course, that you can search across all of the different data from the different tools. When I talked about connectivity, what this enables is that we can get the unified view of an individual or a company or a document or a project. And when it comes to the GDPR case, of course, this is very, very relevant. And not to mention that from a compliance and a governance perspective, it's important for us to be able to have some type of fabric that's doing a lot of the work for us to identify, where are all these personal identifiers of individuals? Where is it located? And does it support not only structured data, but unstructured data as well? So let's have a look at how it's like to be not only data-driven, but compliant with the CluedIn solution. So what I have here is the web application that sits over our data fabric here at CluedIn. So as I log in, what you're actually seeing here is a view into all of the data that sits across the tools that we use here in our back office. So we have different tools for sending mail and managing customers and support. Of course, we have social accounts, ways to communicate, ways to manage notes and tasks. And whenever you're getting started with CluedIn, it always starts with integrations. So to integrate data into CluedIn, all we need to do is head over to our integration section. We can view all the applications that are available for us to plug into this data fabric. So let's take something like HubSpot. HubSpot is our CRM system, and it's just a simple matter of adding configuration, plugging in the authentication mechanism, adding HubSpot, and now these two systems are in sync from source to target. And CluedIn will do all the work to be able to make sure that as soon as data is in the HubSpot system, in real time, it's also sent over to CluedIn to be able to analyze that data. So as you might have seen from our account, CluedIn uses 96 different applications to manage its back office. And you can see all of those integrations where we've already pre-enabled those. So you get the full list of all of the accounts that we have across our business And so you can start to see how this fabric has been pieced together. Let's head over to the data governance section, because the data governance section not only gives me the ability to see the quality and the accuracy of the data that sits across these tools, but it gives me as a manager, this idea of how much of our data is encrypted, what data do we actually have, what's the distributions of the types of data. So this allows me as a compliance officer to get a good bird's eye view of what's the data that we're working with in our business. Now, from a GDPR perspective, one thing that would be nice to be able to do is not only manage the consent within our platform. So as we can see here, we give you out-of-the-box support to be able to manage what consent you need across the source tools to manage data subjects. So if we have a look at our HubSpot CRM system, you can see that we have a consent setup here that says, for us to store personal data within our CRM system, I need to be able to have consent from that individual to have their email, their first name, their last name, and their IP address. And what this means is that we're setting this fabric up to make sure that when we are pulling data out of it, we're only pulling out the data where we actually have consent for the particular use case we're wanting it for. So I'm going to head over to our subject access request part. And we have a good friend that has asked for their particular data. And what's important is that CluedIn out of the box gives you the ability to actually put through these subject access requests, because a lot of the work that it's done has been with unifying an individual's data into one single view. So as I validate the request, I will plug in one of our former colleagues. And what this is going to do is it's going to go off and it's going to find, okay, which person are you actually talking about? And what's most important here is that CluedIn has done the work to make sure that we only have one particular view of Alex here. So as I click next, this will go off and start to generate the report for Alex. And it'll locate all of the personal references to him that has come in from the different sources. Now this could have come from social media, it could have come from mails that were sent internally from us to himself. And within a few seconds you can actually see that I've got a full report breakdown of not only all of the personally identifying information that we have on Alex, but the categorization of data, a breakdown of where these properties were actually sourced from, and as we go down even more, we can actually see a breakdown of what were the individual items that actually were identifying Alex in some way. This might have mentioned Alex, it might have been written by Alex, so you get this great view of the data. Not to mention that you can actually download the data behind this to be able to process data controller requests. So portability requests to be able to move that data to another provider. Now I can go through and I can take certain data off this report if I want, or I can approve it. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow me to send this report off to Alex. And what's most important here is that CluedIn also supports the ability to action all of the possible things that Alex wants us to do with his data. So the anonymization, the minimization, the actual purging and removal of data, or removing Alex from certain processing that's happening within the business. I can also subscribe to Alex. So as soon as new data comes in from different sources, I can actually be notified that we have new data on Alex and it's time to regenerate a report because we obviously have new data available. One of the other things you can do is you can of course put through the rectification requests. So if I was to go down and filter data to the CRM system, here is all the metadata that we have from Alex within the CRM system. If, for example, Alex specifically asked us, hey, can you change my lead status from new to old? And within CluedIn, I can actually just I can put through these requests to change this data in the actual source system. So if we go to our pending changes, you can actually see that it's queuing up all of the operations that need to run to actually make that change in the source system. So this is the compliance part of CluedIn. And if we actually have a look at Alex and search for him within the data fabric, we can actually see that, okay, his record comes up. And what's most important is that we don't see multiple different versions of Alex. He has one record where we can see that he's merged his data from the different sources where we sourced his information from in the first place. Now, to answer this part about the data-driven nature of CluedIn, and we see this myth around companies can't be data-driven and compliant at the same time. And what we say is, well, as long as you have the right checks and balances and right framework and technical underpinning in place, then in fact this is just not the case. So I'm going to show you two examples of how we at CluedIn are making companies data-driven while maintaining this high level of compliance. To work with the data that sits within the data fabric, when we're wanting to push this data off to other systems, CluedIn provides a mechanism via a query language called GraphQL. And what this allows me to do is it allows me to run quite ambiguous queries where we're not so interested in where this data is, but the fact that I just want to get back companies that exist across my entire business. And it's this query language that we can actually use to fuel other systems. So one of the common use cases of CluedIn is to be able to fuel BI tools. And one of the interesting use cases is that when we're showing this charts data, typically the way that it's done is that we connect the sources directly to the BI tools. And what we're missing out on here is all of the cleaning and the deduplication that CluedIn can automate. And so this is one of the use cases that's popular with becoming data-driven with CluedIn. Another use case is the machine learning side of things. So if we have a look at some of the things that we've done with our customers in the past, it would be, will this lead become a customer? So we are wanting to take in data around a company from CluedIn and fuel our machine learning to be able to predict some type of check and balance of, does this customer show the same patterns as your previous customers? And what's most important is that we're making sure that the data that we're sending over to this platform has gone through all of these compliance and policy checks. This is something that you get for free out of using the fabric. So then what are our customers saying? When they're asked, with the investment around CluedIn and with the investment around putting in a technical underpinning for a data fabric, what was the value that came from it? And one of the kind of overarching themes and feedback was that, GDPR was really the perfect catalyst they needed to become data-driven as a company. And so from a GDPR requirement perspective, those requirements of integrating data, cleaning and making sure that the data is kept to high accuracy and quality, the smarts around categorizing and identifying PII data around an individual, these were some of the same things that were necessary to be able to prepare their data for machine learning, for advanced analytics, for knowing more about their customer. When we surveyed these companies, these were the four main pieces of feedback of why they invested in GDPR and did this investment come to fruition. And the top reason was knowing more about their customer. And this is a side effect of being GDPR compliant, is that not only can you serve an individual or a customer or an employee with their data in a very efficient and qualitative manner. But really this also allowed them to get this 360 view of their customer. The next was customer transparency. So the real value of the GDPR for these companies was, how quickly, how efficiently, and how confidently can I give these customers their data, right? This transparency of letting these customers know what they're doing with their data allowed them to kind of fill their customers with this, this kind of transparency that's necessary to trust companies. High data governance was another reason, the ability for management to at least get an overarching view of, what is the status quo of the data that sits across our business? What's the quality we're working with? The completeness? What's the validity of this data? And then finally, it allowed a lot of these companies to actually accelerate in the innovation department, now knowing that they had easy, accessible access to the data that sits across their business. Some of the quick wins that I would like to highlight that we got back from feedback from these companies in our engagements. And the first one was around, strict retention policies. So just the process of going through GDPR from a technical aspect and being able to identify genuinely, do we need to keep this data around? Why do we have this data? Is it for historical reasons? Is it for audit reasons? And we found that a large percentage of our customers were able to save money on not only storage, but processing and archiving, because really it was not necessary to keep this historical data. We found also a pattern that for platforms that were upstream of the data fabric, so these were platforms like BI tools, Tableau, Click, Power BI, that were actually fueling their visualizations off the data fabric. Any data that those systems stored, it was just easier to actually wipe that data on a periodical occasion and refresh from the data fabric. This filled them with confidence that data that was sitting within these BI tools, we were making sure that it was always based off data that we had consent for. We also saw quite a theme of tool consolidation. So just the ability that by the time we had started engaging with these companies, most of them at least put a list together of tools that they were using within their business. And this process allowed them to really identify that they had multiple overlying functionality that this was the right time for them to go back and analyze. And we had multiple customers that had multiple backup and archiving systems that they were able to consolidate into a core set of tooling. From a more future thinking perspective, we found that a lot of these companies had internal projects that were running, that now that they had the infrastructure that had access to good quality data across the business, they actually found that they could cancel a lot of these projects because the fabric had actually given them the right data and the right foundation to be able to fuel these internal projects. And these, of course, were projects around knowing more about their customers. So whether this was in customer support or sales or marketing, just the fact that they had this data fabric in place meant that they could accelerate the innovation of these projects internally instead of having to reinvent it themselves. Like I said, we would be remiss without identifying some of the challenges that came up with these projects and engagements. And when we surveyed these customers, the top challenge was really about what they didn't know they had. So the large amounts of time were spent in tracking down the unknown, i.e., here is a list of tools we think we have. And the fabric was there to really help them understand, where were the most important pieces of data. Let's plug those in first, and let's take a staged approach of, as soon as we discover other tools, we had this fabric, we had this good foundation to plug that data in. We also saw a theme of challenges around building the data culture that was necessary to support data-driven businesses. And without saying, GDPR was very much disruptive for a lot of businesses, and this need to internally train on what was required to become a proper data-driven business. It really needed not only buy-in from top level, but also buy-in from the individuals that are entering the data. These better data policies around managing data was one of the challenges. We also saw a risk versus reality factor. So we had many customers that had terabytes of video and audio data, and for those companies there were challenges around identifying, do we make the investment in analyzing this data for PII data? You could probably understand the amount of processing that would be involved in that. Not to mention that really the technology is not there yet to be able to properly analyze audio and video to get a full picture of the PII data within it. So really there was these challenges around, what do we purge versus what do we need to keep around for audit reasons versus what's realistic for us to process from a GDPR perspective. And I'm sure most people on this webinar would also be aware that there were challenges around clashes between compliance versus IT, and most of these clashes were more based off what parts of being data driven, what parts about maintaining a high level of compliance are we going to solve from a legal and processing perspective versus a technology perspective. So then how do you get started? How do you as a company become much more data driven while maintaining this high level of compliance? And we think it starts with taking the leap. And whether you choose GDPR as the momentum that you're using as your business, or you start from a data-driven perspective and work your way back to compliance, I can say this with one guarantee: that company data has value. Being GDPR compliant has huge value. And the next wave of value will be based off good quality access to data. So thank you all for your time, and if you would like to get in contact to the CluedIn team, please feel free to sign up for a demonstration from our website.